and welcome to today's lecture on the early dynastic period in Egypt. I'm your professor, Dr. Rob Steffen, and today we're going to look at Egypt's evolution from a burgeoning culture to a full-fledged pharaonic state. Along the way, we'll take a look at some of the trappings of kingship, the signs and symbols of power that indicate just how powerful a ruling pharaoh could be. And we'll see that these symbols are interesting because they both represent the power the king actually has, and they help him consolidate even more power in that position. So if you got the courage to smite your enemies and unify the two lands, journey with me as we investigate Egypt's first pharaohs. In today's lecture, we're going to learn about the earliest pharaohs of Egypt. But in order to do that, we need to first understand where our information comes from. We've already seen archaeological remains, like the scorpion mace head, provide useful evidence for the rise of political and military power in the early days of Egypt. Starting with the pharaohs, however, we get new textual sources that help guide our way to understanding Egypt's earliest days. The most important of these texts comes from a guy named Manetho. Now, Manetho was an interesting dude. He was an Egyptian priest living during the Ptolemaic period, when the Greeks ruled Egypt, starting around the 3rd century BCE. During this time, Manetho composed something called the Egyptiaca, or the Egyptiaca, our most complete ancient history of Egypt from its earliest days all the way up to the Ptolemaic period. So his history of Egypt covered nearly 3,000 years. So just be glad that I'm not forcing you to write an essay that long. Within this text, Manetho invented the concept of splitting Egyptian rulers into something called dynasties. Now, when we think of a dynasty in the modern world, we think of a group of royals related by blood. But for Manetho, this was only sometimes the case. For him, what was more important was cultural and political continuity, rather than a direct bloodline. So kings from different families could both be part of the same dynasty as long as the transmission of power was smooth and there wasn't much of a disruption, both for the king and for his people. Manetho divided his history into 30 dynasties, and modern Egyptologists have added a 31st to that list. Now, modern scholars have also invented the idea of kingdoms, or groups of dynasties where royal power was strong, consolidated, and where Egypt really flourished. They also invented intermediate periods, where royal power was weak and fragmented, and some would say that Egypt suffered during these times. So keep these terms in mind as we move forward, because we're going to be using them all quite a bit. So what actually does it mean to be king?
You may have noticed that we've been using the term king and pharaoh interchangeably to describe the ruler of ancient Egypt. The word pharaoh comes from the Egyptian word Pharaoh, which literally means the great house. This term didn't get attached to Egyptian kings, however, until the New Kingdom, almost 2,000 years after Egyptian kingship developed. For our purposes, however, we'll keep using the title of king and pharaoh interchangeably, even if it is sometimes anachronistic.
Now, kingship wasn't just about titles. It was also about displaying power. And what better way to do that than a crown? Now, ancient Egyptian kings had a variety of these. And early on, they were different based on where you lived. So the deshret, or the red crown, was the curly Q-shaped crown for the king of Lower Egypt. You'll remember that's also the name for the desert. The hedjet, or the white crown, well, that was the bowling pin-shaped crown of Upper Egypt. You put those two things together, and you get the peshent, the combined crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Now, many other crowns existed as well, like the nemes, the headdress that you see on the mask of King Tut, and the blue crown, the crown that Egyptian pharaohs would wear into battle.
The crown, of course, is one of the most notable objects of power, what we'd call regalia, associated with the king. A series of scepters, staves, flails, and maces, as evidenced by the scorpion mace head, contribute to the embodiment of royal power in physical objects. And the uraeus, the rearing cobra often found on the king's headdress, was supposed to protect the king by spitting fire at his enemies. So when you see a king smiting an enemy, it's not always representing a historical fact, but rather it's showing his people that he holds power and he can use that power to protect his people and defeat his enemies.
Kings also distinguished themselves when writing their own names. So early on, this was done using the seric. And the seric was a box that displayed the facade of the royal palace on the bottom, and then the symbol or the name of the king on the top. So you can kind of think of this as a precursor to the royal crests of medieval Europe. You know, if that kind of works for you, go with it. Now, here what you can see is you can see the seric of Jet with the royal facade on the bottom, the snake symbol of Jet above it, and then up top the depiction of Horus, the god of kingship, sitting atop it all. Now, later on, this evolved in what we call the cartouche, or that kind of long oval with lines on it that surrounded the royal names and represented divine protection for the person enclosed within.
Now that we have a sense for what kingship is, how it's discussed, and the ways in which it's displayed, let's get back to our story about the rise of kingship in ancient Egypt. We'll remember that towards the end of the pre-dynastic period, we were getting rulers who wore a royal headdress, like the Scorpion King who wore the white crown of Upper Egypt, and he held a pick as though he were about to begin an important irrigation project.
The first evidence we have for the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, however, comes from an artifact known as the Narmer Palette. Now, a palette is a stone artifact that was used for grinding minerals for makeup. And in this case, it's a very highly decorated one. And we can see the king on one side wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt. And on the other side, we can see the king wearing the red crown, suggesting that he's taken power in both places. Moreover, the entangling of the beasts, right, on the back of this thing, well, that suggests that the combining of the two regions of Egypt had recently occurred. And we can see the serics at the top of this thing, with the catfish and chisel signs, giving the name of the person who owned it. Narmer, the king shown here.
How does this match up with Manetho's history? Well, Manetho calls the first king of a united Egypt something completely different, King Menes. And modern scholars have debated extensively about the relationship between these two characters, King Narmer and King Menes, with some suggesting that they're different names for the exact same person, the unifier of ancient Egypt.
Now, regardless of whether they are indeed the same, Narmer is attested in other artifacts as well. This decorative royal mace head should remind you of the previous scorpion mace head. On it, we see Narmer represented as the king of Lower Egypt, with captives bringing him plunder. And at the bottom of this thing, he even records how much he got. 400,000 cattle, 1.4 million goats, and 120,000 captives. Not bad at all for the first king of a united Egypt.
With the unification of Egypt under Narmer, or Menes, or both if they're the same person, Dynastic Egypt began around 3000 BCE, and it would continue for about 3 millennia until Rome began to rule Egypt from abroad in 31 BCE. It's hard to overemphasize just how incredibly long this is. The United States, for example, would have to exist until almost 5000 CE just to have a run as long as ancient Egypt. Let's take a look at some of the early rulers of ancient Egypt to see how they began to solidify their power.
First up, we have King Den, who you can see here smiting one of his enemies. And now here he is, displaying himself with the combined crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the first king ever to wear both of them at the same time. Now, these little ivory labels would have originally been attached to goods of the king, like jars of olive oil or beer. This way, if you shipped goods somewhere, the recipient would know what to expect and how much of it. So if you shipped 7 goats and you had somebody take them for you, you would know that you should expect 7 goats when that person received them. And some scholars think this is actually the way that writing arose for the first time ever in the world.
Evidence from the Palermo stone, an ancient Old Kingdom inscription which provides some of our best evidence for the earliest pharaohs, shows some of Den's accomplishments. When it comes to understanding how the king displayed his power, this inscription is hugely important. First, we can see that the conquering of outsiders plays a major role. Den smites Setjet, the Chem, and the Yumchu people at different points in his reign. Second, we can see that religion plays a major role. Den builds a divine fortress. He creates statues of the gods and goddesses, and he marks his visit to important temples.
Now, finally, Den makes it a point to display his power through public festivals and hunts. He celebrates the Hebsed festival, a festival that demonstrated the continued power and virility of the king. He does that at least twice. And during this festival, the king had to run around a royal religious complex 2 times. And if he made it, power was restored for years to come. But if he didn't make it, well, you didn't want that to happen. In that case, the king was thought to be powerless, and he was killed to make room for a new king. I guess that's a pretty good incentive to stay in shape.
The tomb of King Den is located at the site of El Gab, near the town of Abydos in Upper Egypt. It's one of the largest tombs in the area, and it consists of a large underground chamber with stairs leading down inside of it. Inside the tomb, we get the first ever example of high-quality red and black granite, taken from Aswan in the far south and used to pave the burial chamber.
With the size of the tomb, some scholars think that this may have been used as a storage facility while the king was still alive, which makes it convenient to fill with grave goods after the king is deceased and buried. And all those ivory labels that we saw earlier, often used to identify grave goods and, who they belong to, well, those are all found in the tomb of the king himself.
More interesting, however, is not the artifacts left behind, but the bodies themselves. There were 136 men and women buried along with King Den, and they appear to have died right when the king did. Moreover, forensic archaeologists have suggested that these individuals were strangled in the prime of their lives. Put all that together, and it looks like the kings of the first dynasty practiced human sacrifice, taking their attendants with them into the afterlife.
Just like running the Hebset, or smiting your enemies, human sacrifice is just as much about displaying the power of the king as it is about actually having servants for the afterlife. Pretty quickly, however, people must have stopped applying for the job of, royal attendant if you're going to die when the king dies. Because by the second dynasty, this practice had completely ended. Instead, kings were buried with ushabtis, small royal statuettes that symbolized their attendance. And the idea was that these would come to life and they would then serve the king in the afterworld. I imagine that's the best retirement benefit a royal attendant could have hoped for. Better than being killed, certainly. The unification of ancient Egypt is a fundamental turning point in a deep history of the region, and for human civilization more broadly. We see that almost immediately, kings are displaying their power through iconography such as smiting their enemies, and through clothing such as crowns and headdresses, and even through funerary ritual such as sacrificing 100 or more people to help have them serve you in the afterlife. So if you're looking to rule, you better be sending a constant, multi-varied message about your power. Just a couple lessons you can take away from Egypt's first pharaohs.